Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Tsai, Interim President of Committee of 100. I want to thank all of you for taking the time this afternoon to join us for an important discussion on race-conscious admissions and the recent Supreme Court ruling. In the next hour, we will examine some of the nuances and implications of the court's opinion in the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and versus UNC cases, and specifically how this decision will impact the Asian American community. For those of you who are attending a Committee of 100 event for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who have attended our events previously, welcome back. Committee of 100 is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded nearly 35 years ago. Our dual mission is to advance the inclusion of Chinese Americans in the United States and to foster constructive relations between the US and China. We are excited to kick off this discussion today as high school seniors are thinking about their next chapter and how to navigate the college application process. In late June of this year, the United States Supreme Court issued its rulings in the two high-profile cases on race-conscious admissions. This was the third time in the past 2 decades where the Supreme Court heard cases challenging policies that aim to increase diversity in universities and colleges. The court's finding these policies are unconstitutional will have a significant impact on admissions process and the Asian American community. We are delighted to have an exceptional panel of experts from law, academia, and the nonprofit space today to provide us with their insights on this issue. Our panels include Sally Chen, Education Equity Policy Manager at Chinese for Affirmative Action, Gordon H. Chang, the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities at Stanford University, and John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of AAJC. For some housekeeping, I would like to mention that the audience may submit questions at any time throughout the webinar in the Q&A box. We will address questions in the later portion of the event. Also, once this seminar concludes, an option to complete our post-event survey will appear in your browser. Please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. And one final reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel after the event. Now to begin the discussion, it is my pleasure to welcome and moderate today, Amy Qin, National Correspondent for the New York Times. Amy joined the New York Times in 2012 and specializes in the coverage of Asian American communities. Previously based in Beijing for 8 years, she has written about Taiwan and China at great length, covering the intersection of politics, culture, and society. In 2020, she was on a team of journalists who were named Pulitzer Prize finalists for their work on a series that exposed China's crackdown on Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province. Fluent in Mandarin, Amy is a graduate of University of California, Berkeley, and Oxford University. We are grateful to have her here today to guide this conversation. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy today's webinar.
Hi, Cindy, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the Committee of 100 for giving us this platform to discuss what continues to be a very important discussion, which is about education, the Asian American community, and diversity. So, as Cindy just mentioned, I recently moved back to the US to start a new beat for the paper talking about or covering Asian American communities. And of course, one of the first subjects I had to get up to speed on was the affirmative action debate and how it's been playing out in the Asian American community. I spoke to people on all sides of the issue, and I have to admit, it was pretty head spinning. It felt like in many cases, people were talking past each other. Some were arguing that there was no evidence of discrimination. Others said that there was. And depending on the wording of various surveys, either you had an overwhelming majority of Asian Americans who were in favor of affirmative action, or it showed that it was more evenly divided. I think it's safe to say that this is a very contentious issue and that it continues to be even after the Supreme Court handed down its decision this summer, ruling 6-3, striking down affirmative action and declaring that race-conscious admission programs at Harvard and UNC were unlawful. We're now in the middle of college application season. It's the first after this very landmark decision, and arguably the realm of admissions is murkier even now, more than before affirmative action was struck down. So what does this mean for Asians and Asian Americans? Before the decision came out, I wrote a story about how the belief in some circles that there is a so-called Asian penalty has led some students to downplay their Asianness on their college applications. How might this decision impact the way Asians now think about approaching their racial identity on their college applications? What's the essential context that we need to really understand this issue from all sides? What are the next frontiers of the debate over race-conscious policies? What role should the idea of diversity play in admissions and in other realms as well, like employment and procurement and more? These are all very big questions, and in the next hour, I'm hoping that we're very lucky to have this distinguished panel here to talk to us about this issue and many of these questions. They work closely with and within the Asian American communities. They have firsthand experience with the issue, and they're going to help us dissect the decision from a legal perspective and also talk about it from the perspective of the institutions and the community. First, we have Sally Chen, who is the Education Equity Program Manager at Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco. Sally is a first-generation college graduate and from a working-class immigrant family, and she was one of 8 Harvard students and alumni that gave oral testimony in support of affirmative action in the 2018 federal lawsuit Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. Gordon Chang is a professor of history at Stanford University and the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities and the author of many books about Chinese Americans and the Asian American experience. He's also a member of the Committee of 100, though we should note that Gordon is speaking to us today in his personal capacity and his views is not necessarily reflecting the official views of Stanford or the Committee of 100. And John C. Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which is doing great work on the community and advocating on policy issues. John has an extensive track record of government service and law, and he's going to help us parse the Supreme Court decision today from a legal perspective. So without further ado, I think we can maybe kick it off with some prepared remarks from Sally.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation from all the panelists as well. My name is Sally Chen. I am the Education Equity Policy Manager at Chinese for Affirmative Action. Our organization is a 50-plus-year-old civil rights nonprofit based in San Francisco, and we are one of the co-founding organizations of the National Stop API Hate Coalition. So to just add on to what Amy and Cindy have talked about already, the Supreme Court decision that came out this past summer, overturned 40 years of existing case law that has affirmed over and over that colleges have been allowed to consider race when factoring the diversity of their admitted class alongside gender, socioeconomic status, sexuality, geography, legacy status, and so much more. And we really saw that this conservative stacked Supreme Court went against history, precedent, and the evidence of the case to disallow this practice, ultimately using Asian Americans as a face for this case and taking advantage of some real concerns to attack all of our civil rights. And I hope this panel today gets into as well this question of where does this leave us? To give a little bit more information and context about myself, this issue has been really deeply personal for me. I testified in federal court as to how, as personally, the Chinese American, I benefited from race-conscious policies like affirmative action. And my personal admissions file was submitted as evidence as to how Asian Americans benefit from affirmative action. I'm a first-generation college student and the daughter of monolingual working-class immigrants. My parents worked in the restaurant and service industry, and growing up, I was a translator and an advocate on many different fronts for my parents and family, whether it was about overdue rent or insurance letters in the mail or navigating unemployment for both my parents. These experiences really shaped my desire to do a lot of the work that I do today in communities with immigrants, communities of color in particular. And my motivations and aspirations were really inseparable from my identity, as was the case for a lot of my peers that I had the privilege of learning alongside at Harvard. And I ended up writing about these experiences in my personal statement when I applied to Harvard. But I'll note when I was applying to college, I had a counselor tell me that I shouldn't talk about race, that an Asian immigrant story wasn't compelling, was overdone. And looking back, I think about how painful that was to hear as a young student. And as an adult now, how really irresponsible and harmful that narrative is to push us to hide who we are and what we experience. And in the end, I decided to keep my essay as it was. And at Harvard, my admissions file showed that my application readers appreciated my perspective and my experiences. But more importantly, I was authentic to myself. And I think a lot about my development from being that high school student to now, and how that was really critical to shaping who I've become. And I got involved with this case because I believe that the barriers and struggles we face as Asian Americans are very real and need to be recognized. And solutions to these issues can't come from turning a blind eye to race in this country. Affirmative action and race-conscious policies are not the problem. They are and have been and continue to be part of the solution. So I hope some of the takeaways that attendees today can hear in one part in terms of both the legal context of this case, but also in terms of student development and supporting youth, that for all the students that have asked me and my colleagues, does my story still matter? Can I still talk about what I've experienced, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the context of this rise in anti-Asian violence and sentiment? My answer is wholeheartedly yes, you can and should still talk about race. You are still allowed to, and you should not feel that you need to self-censor. And a lot of CAA's ongoing work, to summarize quickly, is trying to tackle some bigger policy issues. We know Asian America is not a monolith, and we still see major policy gaps that need race-conscious solutions. We know that COVID-19 disproportionately affected communities of color, and we want to call for investments in women and minority-owned businesses. Think of the mom and pop stores in Chinatowns and Little Tokyos across the country. This question of how can we be calling for this in a race-blind manner just does not stand. And in higher education specifically, CAA is really focused on reinvesting in community colleges. I'll say too that the disproportionate media focus on the Ivy League is very concerning. And when you look at, for example, at the community college in San Francisco alone, there are more Asian Americans served than undergraduate Asian Americans across the Ivy League put together. So really supporting where students are getting their education and making sure it's high quality, removing barriers to education, such as excessive norm-based testing, and supporting high schools to prioritize diversity and desegregation when we think about the pipeline. And finally, I want to name, and I'll share this resource as well later on, but the question of how do we drive narrative change? How do we engage communities to talk about education, to want to get involved, to shape what our education system looks like? How can we engage Asian Americans in particular, younger generations, to not become disillusioned, is one that we've been really excited to work on. And we've worked on a narrative toolkit that we hope to move forward generally on education equity to answer some of those questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm in Southern California right now. And let me just say one word about who I am. I'm a professor at Stanford. I've been at Stanford in the faculty for several decades. And I also did my graduate work at Stanford, so I know the university very well. Of late, I was also the Senior Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, and I'll refer to that, some information I got from that position in a moment. So I would like to get right to the questions which I think probably are on many of your minds, and that is, well, how are universities such as Stanford responding to the Supreme Court decision? And what changes are they making to the admissions process? Well, I think those are key questions, the answers to which I'll try to address. But we are still too soon, too close to the decisions to know what the full implications may be. We'll have to see what's going to go on in this current admission cycle. And we're right in the thick of it with deadlines coming up, which I'm sure many of you are quite aware of. Now, that all said, I would have to say is that the admissions process at Stanford, and I would say most all other competitive or institutions, And that's one of the most opaque processes there is in the university. We can know more about its investment policies than we know about its admissions policies. This is very closely guarded secret with regards to what visions the top administration has and the Board of Trustees has about the composition and the requirements to get into some place like Stanford. All right, so I want to use these remarks by the new provost to the university, Jenny Martinez. She was the dean of the law school up until late September. And she spoke recently to the faculty senate. And there's some paraphrasing here, but I also want to quote so that you can see exactly what she is saying. So she has said that there will be short-term adjustments to the admissions process to comply with Supreme Court ruling. And that's been said repeatedly by Harvard and others, that they will comply with the Supreme Court ruling and the federal government implementation guidelines. There's no define the Supreme Court. That said, that means that they understand. That means that race and ethnicity as such can no longer be factors considered in the admissions process. Applicants may still share information about their race in the course of describing their achievements and experiences. But as the Supreme Court said, it is the achievement or experience that can be evaluated, not the race of the individual. So there is a sort of a specific reading of the decision that the idea that race is a factor, such as geographical location or income, cannot be included in the application process. But racial experiences and identities can be discussed in the context of talking about personal achievement or expectations or a future. So that means apparently that application readers won't receive applicants' race and ethnicity checkbox information. I think the checkbox will still be included. Maybe John will know about this further in a moment. He can say something about it in a moment. Because there is some, it is valid to collect such data for reporting purposes so that people will know what the composition is of the applicant pool, and then later on who is admitted. But the readers apparently will not receive this information, which used to be which used to be done. I have to say that I'm just deeply disappointed and angered by the decision, because I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action. I grew up in the Oakland area, and I went to Princeton as an undergrad, and I know I was included in that class in the late 1960s because of the opening up of the universities to minorities, and without the push to open up and to diversify, I would not have been there. Now, let's go into the next question. Is the university, now what is it going to do? The university is also deeply committed to having diversity and inclusion in its undergraduate student body. We remain committed to seeking a student body that is diverse in background, experience, interests, and perspectives. We are a diverse community, and that diversity is central to the education and research that occur here and its excellence. We also continue to be committed to a holistic review of every applicant to the university, a review that considers the broad array of accomplishments and life experience of each student. The admission staff will look at many indicators, and I put this in bold, of achievement, that is like SAT scores, grade, and promise. And promise is very, very key. It's a qualitative dimension, of course, but we can talk about that. Now, lastly, so the university is going to make a big effort to continue to expand diversity and to reach out to other communities. Lastly, the question will be, what do we expect this decision will have on Asian American admissions, admissions generally? Last night, I had dinner with faculty from Harvard, Caltech, Michigan, and Duke. And all of them believe that there is going to be an effect, and they expect to see a decline in the number of African American and Latinx admits, because fewer of them will go into the applicant pool, and expect to see some increase in Asian American admissions and a bigger increase among whites. So why that is going to be so, and how universities are going to respond to this, because this is not something which universities want to see, is something we can talk about. So thank you for your attention. And I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you, Sally. The two of them covered a little bit of what the decision entailed. I'll go into a little bit more detail, and actually I'll get into some of the questions that probably are on people's minds that even I'm starting to see in the chat box. First, by way of introduction, so I am the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We're a civil rights organization that's based in DC. Our affiliation had the privilege of representing Sally in the Harvard case in her testimony. And we have been a champion of affirmative action and race-conscious policies of all sorts, because we recognize that we are not in a world where we are race-blind. So with respect to the decision, as Sally and Gordon said, what the decision ultimately holds is that race cannot be used to automatically favor an individual applicant. Typically, they call it what's called a tip, a plus factor, that would, if you see a person's race, you would give them a plus factor. What the court said is that is, under constitutional law, not a sufficiently compelling interest. Specifically, the argument that had been presented before was that universities' desire to have diversity on campus and the educational system that it produces requires that diversity was considered a compelling interest. The court found that that's not so much of a compelling interest. The court also found that that interest is too vague or ill-defined. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the court still said that it is very well intentioned to have a diverse population on campus, that it is an admirable goal, I think were the words used by Chief Justice Roberts. So even the court recognizes that diversity on campus is a good thing, and we should strive to get that. The question is, how do we get there? And for the court, in the admissions process, adding that tip was inappropriate. But while we say that, it's also important to recognize what the court did not hold, and sort of how we parse that out. Gordon already talked about it. It did not hold that you cannot use race at all. In fact, the Chief Justice Roberts specifically said in his majority opinion that certainly an applicant can talk about how race, he or she faced discrimination, inspiration from his race, her ethnicity, how they presented themselves. So to Sally's point about having a college application essay that talks about what race meant to you, and that is true for Asian Americans as well, is certainly compelling. And I would take issue with those college counselors that are saying that it is not a compelling story to talk about that first generation immigrant story, because that is something that all of us recognize to be compelling, and frankly, a lot of people can identify with. Second, it's important to recognize that the Supreme Court did not find that there was discrimination against Asian Americans in these policies. That was the premise of the lawsuit that was presented by Edward Bloom on behalf of SFFA. The notion that Asian Americans were being intentionally discriminated against at these universities. The district court found that that was not the case. The statistical evidence demonstrated that there was no discrimination against Asian Americans in the process. The appellate court, in a similarly lengthy, I believe, 75-page opinion, found the same thing. The court didn't disturb that. It just simply said that race should not be considered writ large. To address a couple of points that Gordon raised. So number one is that certainly race should be collected in the application process, because that will matter for understanding the demographics of student bodies. That will matter in understanding trajectory of people. We have to continue to collect that, and I would push back against any universities that don't. Number two is typically when it goes to the admissions reviewer, we know that the admissions reviewer does not see the names of the individual applicants. So to address one of the questions, names will not be presented to the admissions review person, and so that won't present a concern. Likewise, the race box will not be presented. Last thing that I know is on everyone's mind, which goes to the discrimination question. Well, what happens? Gordon's right. The studies that we have seen say that at most, Asian Americans might gain 2% in the admissions policy, maybe 3% without affirmative action. In contrast, white Americans probably gain about 8%. And obviously the big drop is for Hispanic Americans and African Americans. So the question is, how do we promote educational equity? How do we promote diversity, recognizing that we are not in an equal system yet, and that we need to find ways together to get there? With that, I will yield back to Amy and start our discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was fascinating. And we've already had quite a few questions come in, so let's just jump straight to it. Michael Chang asked in a question submitted prior to the panel, the race-based admissions legal challenge was raised by a white man whose goal is to get himself noticed. There is questionable intent that he was doing all the work on behalf of helping Asian American students in the quest for admissions into named educational institutions of higher learning. Did we get used or duped into supporting an individual or cause that is causing more damage to the race relations with the other ethnic groups? And what did we get or expected to receive in return?
Well, if I may, I'll start. I would say we did get used by Ed Bloom. Our community was used as a political wedge to drive a wedge between us and African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Even while I say that, I recognize that many in our community felt like they have been discriminated against. And so I am not saying that they were dupes. I am not saying that they were naive. Their feelings and experiences are real, and I want to validate that. But the issue is not with affirmative action and this policy that Ed Bloom was driving. The issue is just more general about educational equity. Generally, even about how we talk about merit, right? If we talk about merit, we need to put on the table issues such as legacies, issues such as the children of faculty, issues such as sports scholarships, issues such as the dean's interest list. This is a list that is compiled by the dean or president of a college that says, hey, these people deserve a special review. I mean, it's no coincidence, and I'm bipartisan about that, that people like Jenna Bush, Chelsea Clinton, Jodie Foster get into Ivy League schools. I'm not saying they don't deserve to, but that goes to that equity policy. We're getting used if we just focus on affirmative action and not talk about all of these broader issues.
Let me say, I was very proud of many in the Asian American community, such as Sally and others, who spoke so passionately from their own experiences about what race-conscious admissions meant. It was a help to them and a help to their educational experience. So I was actually quite gratified at the number of organizations that came out to recognize how race-conscious admissions was beneficial for us, and we can talk about how that was so, but also because of the importance of alliance and working together with other communities. Now, it's the admissions process, and I would have to say some in the Asian American community have labored under misconceptions about what admissions, how it's conducted. And there is a belief that metrics such as GPAs and grade as SAT scores are or should be the sole measure of worth and getting someone into a college of their choice. That couldn't be further from the reality. The reality is that the admissions process has always been multifaceted. Today, it is much further along and much more progressive and open, despite what I said about being opaque, than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when really class and race, that is, if you were white, you lost, so much different chance of getting in, and virtually no chance if you were not in those categories to get into an elite institution. So how do admissions offices work? They look at, as the comment said from Martinez, in a holistic way, to look at achievement, that is academic achievement in middle school and high school, on the sports field, in concert halls, and in medical rooms. There are students who are admitted because they've overcome immense challenges of health challenges. Those are taken into account. It's the admissions process is very complex and challenging, and the issue of race and of GPA, or the GPA issue is one, but only one of a number of different factors.
Just one other part I'll jump in on, in particular, just to add on what has come out of this case. I would really encourage people to keep an eye on what organizations like the ones that Ed Blum are pushing forward are bringing lawsuits towards next. And I think they are very indicative of his interests and ultimately the harm that the overextension of race blindness does to our society and to the interests and rights of Asian Americans. For example, some of the lawsuits he's bringing forward are attacking fellowships at law firms, private law firms that are named as promoting diversity and inclusion for LGBTQ communities, for law students of color. He is bringing lawsuits against private venture capital firms. For example, that's the Fearless Fund in Atlanta, that is essentially an organization that is trying to bring investments from Black women investors to other Black women entrepreneurs. So this idea of minority and women-owned businesses, and he's bringing lawsuits against them under the same ideas that he has been trying to push with the Harvard case and UNC case, this idea that any kind of race consciousness is unfair or not allowed. And we know that for Asian Americans in particular, there are so many areas where we still see such drastic inequities, that we have in Asian America writ large, that we have the highest income disparity of any other racial group, that we know that targeted investments and diversity in workforce are still really relevant, where areas where we are not actually represented in specific fields, in the legal field and others as well. And I would just name that, right? That if you thought what was going to come out of this case was going to be beneficial to Asian Americans, I'd really highlight and point to these actual cases that Ed Blum is bringing forward that he sees as the actual logical next step.
Okay, moving on. Gabriel Young asks, recognizing that Southeast Asians are aggregated to the Asian population and many believe that they are negatively impacted by affirmative action, are there any efforts to disaggregate data to accurately depict student populations and explore ways to increase the diversity of the Asian American population?
I can start a little on this because I think a fascinating piece of what John had mentioned with this idea of a slight increase in Asian American enrollment in highly rejective, selective institutions is this question of which Asian Americans are being given access and being actually supported to attend these institutions, right? This question of how do we disaggregate within Asian America, and whether we are talking about students from low-income backgrounds or from Southeast Asian or Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian communities that are often lumped in under this broader Asian America, this question is a really important one, right? When we think about what does it just mean for there to be changes in percentages of enrollment? Like, where are these students coming from? So there are definitely, I would say, efforts to encourage continued tracking of race and ethnicity data, because we know we can't identify a problem if we don't see one. So there is definitely ongoing efforts for that. And I would actually encourage too, because so much of the implementation of this will be at the local and state level, for folks to also keep an eye on what their own alma maters, what their home institutions, what their state institutions will be doing. But as we've seen so far as the legal case of this goes, there should be no reason that people are not tracking race and ethnicity data and are not trying to make decisions about encouraging diversity writ large, in terms of, for example, encouraging matriculation, full financial aid packages, providing, for example, mentorship pathways, or even affinity groups between alumni and local communities. There's a lot that colleges and universities can actually do that doesn't directly tweak this question of the tip and admissions, but is actually still focusing on trying to diversify and trying to get this accurate picture.
Yeah, specifically on this data disaggregation, there is a movement right now The expectation is that the federal government will issue new guidance in summer of next year. This is something that a number of our organizations have been working on, and that new guidance would mandate disaggregation within the Asian American community. This is something that I believe California already has. Massachusetts just recently implemented. That will be certainly helpful for all the things that Sally is talking about. Also, that's critically important for other communities. Right now, if you're from the Middle East or North Africa, you have to check the box for white. And so like there is a lot of inequity even in the data that's being collected that we need to get through.
Let me respond to a question or an assumption that's sometimes made. Let's say back in next spring when the acceptances go out, and we do see an increase here and there as we discussed before. Some might jump to the conclusion that that's evidence that there had been discrimination before against Asians and whites in favor of African Americans and Latinos. Well, that may be the case in maybe a couple of instances or but overall, I would say probably, and I think this is what universities are fearful, that the drop in expected acceptances is because fewer Blacks and Latinos will be applying, because they're demoralized. And they believe this decision means that now they are not going to be given a fair chance. So it is wrong for us to conclude or to assume that even if there are 2-3% increase in Asian Americans, it's because there had been discrimination before. I don't think that's the case. The real issue, I think, is really for us as a community to think about, and for those who think about their children about admissions, is to think about the admissions process in a very serious, sober-minded way about what you think universities are looking for. And there I go back to the holistic evaluation and the issue of achievement, accomplishment, but also promise. And how do universities, anybody, consider promise? And that's very important in the university's minds to thinking about the future of this country.
I'm going to combine a few questions together from people. It seems that most of the panel believes that the Supreme Court made the wrong decision, yet Amy said when she dug into this, she saw many perspectives and sides. What were the most compelling views on the other side to round out this hour? Are they just using the wrong facts? And someone was also asking, how did the court explain the difference in test scores for admitted Asian Americans? And there was also questions about Harvard's personality ratings. So, John, I think you had mentioned that, the court did not find that there had been any discrimination against Asian Americans. I wonder if you could just address some of these concerns.
Sure. The district court, which was affirmed by the appellate court, found that there was no discrimination. There's always a lot of questions about academic ratings and test scores. So at the district court level, the evidence presented, even from the plaintiff's expert, the people that oppose affirmative action, ultimately the court concluded that it was statistically insignificant, the differences between personal ratings and academic ratings for Asian Americans as compared to others. Frankly, if anything, if I remember the district court in a footnote, and I know I'm getting weedy here, actually found that the academic ratings for Asian Americans seemed unnecessarily high. If anything, they were being inflated. So we were being discriminated in our favor on the academic ratings when compared to other communities. Bottom line is there was no statistical evidence. Look, I get it. I mean, where I think people are coming from is it's hard when you have a friend or your own kids are rejected at some of these schools. But the reality is what? About 50% of people with perfect, or 1 in 4 of people with perfect SATs get rejected by Harvard. About half of the people that have, more than that. I think 3 out of 5 valedictorians get rejected by Duke and Princeton. So it's a competitive system. And this goes to what Sally is talking about too. It's like, how are we talking about equity? Why are we focusing just on these elite universities as opposed to think about how we talk about this more holistically, about an education system that works for all of us?
Yeah, one piece I'll add on, again, this is more footnotes to get into the weeds, but I want to acknowledge too that when I got involved with this case as a student, it was never to push the idea that the status quo was perfect or that Harvard and their current admissions practices were perfect and that there was no room to improve or no room to actually fix what we saw were gaps. So, for example, some of the footnotes that came out from this case, there was a piece around high school letters of recommendation for Asian American students. At the high school level, there was essentially evidence that showed that college counselors giving letters of recommendation for Asian American high school students overall gave much weaker recommendations than for other students, right? But that's not within the scope of this case. And unfortunately, right, the things that Ed Blum was pushing for, the things that were going to come out of the Supreme Court case, were never going to address some of the realities that we were seeing, right? The idea that model minority stereotyping is very real, and how do actually students navigate this fairly opaque, as Gordon said, admission system, right? Where is their linguistic access? Where is their attempts to try to improve the system? When I got involved in this, I think the hope was also that we could try to turn some of this attention onto the actual solutions for some of these problems that we were seeing in naming, right? That we do see that Asian Americans face barriers and discrimination in society and education, not in affirmative action, not in admissions, for all the reasons that have already been talked about, but that we know that there's so much that needs to be done, that we weren't satisfied with the status quo, and that we wanted this energy to go towards positive solutions. And so all of those to say as well that there's lots of room for acknowledging and trying to actually hold some of this nuance, but again, wasn't within the realm of this case.
Gordon, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit about the model minority myth also? We had a question about that, and Sally just mentioned it, and whatever you wanted to add too.
Thanks, Amy. I just point out this. We talk, statistics are used in a lot of different ways. And let's say the Asian American population in the United States is around 5%. John, Sally, or Amy, that's about right? About 5% of the U.S. population is of Asian ancestry.
7% right now, but yes. Right.
So 5 to 7%. So do you know what percentage of the Stanford class admissions for the past 10 years has been? It goes between 20 and 25%. You want to compare our presence in the population and our presence at Stanford, and that percentage between 18 to 25%, it runs all through all the elite institutions. At the UCs, some of the classes are over 50% Asian American. So if you look at that, one can make an argument that there's something else really going on, and it's not discrimination negatively against Asian Americans. In fact, the current application that university systems have grossly helped Asian, and I would say grossly, have tremendously helped Asian Americans. When I was at, as I said, when I was applying to college, I went to Princeton, it was under 1% Asian American, under 0.5% Asian American. And now Princeton is somewhere like 15 to 20%.
And did you want to say a little bit more? We had a question from Jennifer Ho about the role of the model minority myth and the ways that some Asian Americans might be buying into the model minority myth and the anti-Black and anti-brown racism that also exists in Asian American communities. If you or John or Sally, if you had any thoughts on this.
I can kick us off. And I mean, I'm sure Gordon could expand about the history too, which, model minority myth, it has a historical context. It came out of really conservative political strategy of like the 60s and 70s, that it's really dangerous, I would say, for two reasons. And this is related to affirmative action. One is that this acceptance, or this even buying into an idea that Asian Americans are monolithically successful, that they do not benefit from a consideration of race or how racism affects their lives, really obfuscates actual need, right? For all the reasons we talked about, data disaggregation or socioeconomic status or educational outcomes for specific subsets within the Asian American umbrella, that the model minority myth is a myth, and it really is obfuscating and about withholding access to resources for community members, right? That if you are trying to, screaming, crying out to your governments, your institutions for help, and their assumption is that you do not need it, that you are not worthy of it, that's a real danger, for one. But for two, I would say too, that the model minority myth is not just about accepting this idea of monolithic success. It's about being weaponized against other communities of color, specifically Black communities. that is where a lot of the origins of this comes from. It is about using us as a middleman to also gut and undercut the types of resources, support, and investments in other communities, and pointing to us as, if this community doesn't need it, why does yours, right? Using and holding us up as a false excuse to actually disinvest and continue to cause harm and not address ongoing harm. So that's part of what this case has been really dangerous for promoting.
I have a opinion. Sally talks about the broader society, but I think the model minority view that many Asian Americans have bought into it. And they believe, yes, we are model, because what does that mean? And how to be recognized and appreciated in America means that we work hard, we're quiet, we don't rock the boat, we don't take risks, we just do the work. Now, in some sense, those are all admirable. I mean, qualities of working hard and all this. But when you think about what this translates to students, to young people, it means don't be risk-taking, don't be innovative, don't be creative, don't stand out. And my hunch is that a lot of the applications that come into admissions office are model of the former, that they are, and here I'm perhaps provocative, they're very conservative in the way they present themselves as a profile, as a model. I am a model minority. And admissions offices want to see, it goes back to the issue of promise and leadership, and potential. They want to see people who, in many instances, will break out of molds, will be unusual, will be leaders in various ways, in sports or in politics or whatever, and not just be quiet and unassuming, but just work hard. There are those, and they'll get in, but the profile can't be just prioritizing that kind of profile.
And if I can jump in just one piece there, I think this question of what kind of education do we want our students to be engaging in? What do we want people to get out of education is a really good one. I think a lot of conversations have come out now about, after coming out of college, what's next, right? This is a 4-year part of someone's much longer career educational journey. And I would love to share, this is just in the chat for folks who are interested, that Asian American Futures, Shincheon Project, and CAA work together on some message testing about how to talk to Asian Americans about education in a way that's exciting for them. That's not just about hyper competition to the detriment of your mental health, to the detriment of your happiness. What is at the heart of education that we can get people excited about and get people to feel that they're able to have agency in? So if people are interested, I'll share it in the chat now.
I think there are quite a few questions from people kind of now looking forward. What kind of solutions, this is from Cheryl Wooden, do you recommend for colleges and organizations, including corporations, to maintain diversity and inclusion in their classes? What does it mean? What is the role of merit now in admissions? Maybe would anyone like to take that on?
Well, first, nothing in the decision says anything about recruitment. And so certainly colleges and universities, again, the Supreme Court itself recognized that diversity is a good goal, it's a laudable goal. So colleges and universities really have it upon themselves to do even a better job of recruiting from places that they didn't recruiting from unusual places. Also, going to Sally's point, making sure that people are encouraged to apply, people that thought, oh, I would never get into Harvard, or I would never even get into a community college. Why am I bothering doing this? To understand that they have a shot and that what that looks like. Like for all of us, and I think all of us as Asian Americans recognize that. It's like we always talk about the lack of role models. That's the truth for so many communities. And so that's where universities have to step in. Same thing with corporations in the DEI space. It's interesting because, again, here Asian Americans are always talking about how we are underrepresented. Well, this is the same issue, right? Is, okay, if we're talking about being underrepresented, how do we work together to do more recruitment, to do more retention, to do more promotion? In that sense, it's no different than higher education. And I do worry, and I will somewhat call out those that are talking about being anti-affirmative action, but want greater diversity in the workforce. To me, that is become somewhat of a double standard.
I'll just reiterate what I said is I think Asian Americans need to reject the model minority view as something that's put upon us, but also as something that we should aspire to be, because I think that leads to a profile that is very conservative and doesn't open up possibilities for leadership and advancement and else, because that's what industry wants, that's what education wants, to see people who are going innovators, creative, original, not just coders, not just people who've done well on standardized tests and this, but people who are creative. Now, Stanford gets something like 50,000 applications for admission. It accepts about a little over 2,000. The acceptance rate is under 5%. I spoke to one person, they said, look, 30% of the applicants who apply to Stanford, 30% of them are clearly capable of doing the work at Stanford. So it's not the question that the 5% that get in are the best, they're going to do the best and take the most advantage, but they're thinking about how these 30,000 who are intellectually, educationally, pedagogically, whatever you want to call it, are already outstanding. But who from among them are going to be able to augment and enhance the educational experience of peers while they're at Stanford, and also go on after graduation to become outstanding citizens, persons of this world, to make contributions to make it better. Institutions like Stanford are committed to trying to seek human advancement and improvement, and not just individual improvement.
Thank you so much. And I see that we're running out of time. And so I just wanted to just open the floor just for the three of you to give some final remarks. I know, Sally, you had mentioned about narrative change earlier, that maybe you wanted to touch on that, but just maybe a minute each, and then we can close out.
Sure, I can kick us off. I hope that some of these links can be shared after, but I'll just note that it's really important that we have these venues to be in conversation, that we engage people on their real concerns, what their experiences really are, and make sure that they can feel seen in a lot of these issues that are often debated about, but don't get at the heart of what they may be feeling. So I shared our English language message testing on education equity for people to take a look at, about how we try to talk to one another and come to a common understanding about diversity, solidarity, and for people to see valid paths forward that are not driving towards burnout, hyper-competition, and a false belief in meritocracy that doesn't work for all of us or any of us. And then the other is our Chinese language work. CAA does a lot of in-language, particularly for online audiences, fact-checking, addressing misinformation and disinformation. That can be a really great start for talking about what is really important as well, which is the facts.
Gordon or Sean?
Well, I'll just say very, very quick. We got wonderful role models out in society now. It's so much for Asian Americans, creative industries, arts, writing, private industry, research. And I hope that those individuals, those communities can inspire young Asian Americans to be daring, to be creative, to break out of molds. I think this benefits them. They can be happier. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Stanford undergraduates of Asian ancestry and how unhappy they are because their parents told them, you have to be a doctor, you have to be this, you have to be, and they wanted to be a creative writer or something like this. Now, they did get into Stanford maybe because they did get good grades and all that, but they're not happy. And I think it behooves us to, as a community, to use our voices, to use our creative ability, to use our activism and energy to really stand out in those ways, in addition to standing out in academic achievement.
My last thought is, one of the questions sometimes I'm asked is, why am I defending the African American and Hispanic American community? I sometimes make a point of meeting with protesters that do not support affirmative action and talking to them. At one of those rallies, they actually called me a traitor to my race. And I'll admit, that struck me hard, but here's what I would say to that. Number one is, I am defending Asian Americans by defending affirmative action, because there are so many Asian Americans that have benefited from affirmative action in many ways, not just in higher ed, but in all sorts of different walks of life. There are so many of us that are getting left behind. So number one is, I am defending all of us on that. I respect your differences of opinion on that. But number two is I also feel like we are defending, humanity as a whole and the diversity that all of us represent. When people tell me, well, why are we doing this when African Americans don't stand up for us? African Americans are the reason that we enjoy the civil rights that we do here in the United States, going back to the 1960s, going back to slavery. And so for us to say that they did nothing for us is frankly very outrageous. And that's something that we need to remember, is that solidarity allows all of us to move together forward and not get into these divisions, political wedges that people want to put us in. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but I think it was a great hour of thinking about this issue, and clearly there's going to be a lot more conversation to come. So thank you again to the panelists. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to the Committee of 100, and please take a moment after the webinar concludes to complete a short survey on your browser, sharing your feedback on this event, and I hope to see you all again soon.